The Hobbit was released in 1977 and was directed by Arthur Rankin Jr. and Jules Bass, based on the novel by J.R.R. Tolkien, and stars Orson Bean, Richard Boone, Hans Conried, and John Huston. And it follows a homebody hobbit in Middle-earth who gets talked into joining a quest with a group of dwarves to recover their treasure from a dragon. I was initially struggling trying to find a film to talk about for this week, and with tomorrow actually being my birthday, I thought to celebrate I'd review something that was important to me. So I looked at all my favorite movies I haven't reviewed on the channel yet, and didn't really find any I wanted to talk about just yet. So I went to the next best thing, movies from my childhood, and that's where this film came in. To start, I have to say that I grew up with the Lord of the Rings trilogy from Peter Jackson. I saw every single one in the theater when I was very young, and they are three of the most important films to me because those movies are where my love for film actually began. And during that time in my childhood, I was so obsessed with Lord of the Rings. I was clamoring for more, such as the Ralph Bakshi animated Lord of the Rings, which was another film I watched a ton as a kid. And then there was this film. Funny enough, this was actually my first exposure to the story of The Hobbit. Not from the book, but this little animated film, and I remember going to our local Circuit City, which some of my younger viewers will probably never have heard of before, and I found this film in a DVD digipack, which I still own. And it quickly became one I would watch over and over again by myself or with my parents. I liked its creativity and how it told its story, especially after reading the Hobbit book to see how well they adapted the story, and I loved the music. But most importantly, it gave me more of what I wanted, more time in Middle-earth. And so this film holds a lot of sentimental value to me, and I'm so glad to finally talk about it here. But before we get into that, let's do what we always do here and go behind the scenes to see just how this film was made. The film is based on the book of the same name by J.R.R. Tolkien, a professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford, and it was originally published in 1937 and quickly became a classic children's story on release. But its original intention was as a bedtime story for Tolkien's children. The book finally received its first adaptation in 1977 when it was produced and directed by Arthur Rankin Jr. and Jules Bass of Rankin Bass Productions in New York City, who were most well known for their stop-motion Christmas specials, such as Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and Santa Claus is Coming to Town. The film would be adapted for the screen by Romeo Moeller, who had worked as writer previously on many of Rankin Bass's other projects, mainly their holiday TV specials. Rankin would also take on additional duties as production designer and claimed he would not be adding anything to the story that wasn't in the original book, and so with a budget of $3 million, they got to work on the film. Rankin and Bass were able to make the film at the time due to the film still being in the public domain, which allowed them easy access to adapt the work for the small screen. However, there are some discrepancies with this, it seems, when it comes to the copyright holders, but regardless, the film got made nonetheless with no real issues. When it came to casting for the film, there's a large cast of known talent littered throughout this, such as Orson Bean, who plays the protagonist, Bilbo Baggins, as well as famed Hollywood director and actor John Huston as the voice of Gandalf. In supporting roles, you had comedian Brother Theodore as Gollum and Thurl Ravenscroft as the singing voices for the goblins. Richard Boone would provide the gravelly voice of the dragon Smaug. And on top of that, we have director Otto Preminger playing the Elven King as well. So, a well-rounded cast all around. The Hobbit was animated by Topcraft in Tokyo, which is a now defunct Japanese animation studio whose animation team actually reformed as Studio Ghibli under Hayao Miyazaki, while some animators went to establish Pacific Animation Corporation. This was not the first or last time Topcraft would end up working with Rankin Bass, as they had previously been involved in 'Twas the Night Before Christmas, which were released 3 years prior to this film, and The Last Unicorn in 1982. Rankin would go on to say that much of the visual style for the film took inspiration from the early illustrations of Arthur Rackham. Topcraft would produce the animation overseas, while the concept art was completed at Rankin Bass Studio under the direction of Arthur Rankin. Lester Abrams did the initial designs for most of the characters, but principal artists included coordinating animator Toru Hara, supervising animator and character designer Sugiyuki Kubo, character and effects animator Hideyotoshi Kaneko and Kazuko Ito, and background designer Minoru Nishida. And much of the same artists and studio would also work on the follow-up to this film, The Return of the King. Jules Bass primarily adapted Tolkien's original lyrics from the book for the film's music, and he was assisted by Maury Laws, the studio's composer, on an original theme for the film called The Greatest Adventure, sung by Glenn Yarbrough as the sole original song for the film and kind of the anthem for the movie itself. The Hobbit first aired as a TV special in 1977 with the goal of producing a tie-in storybook and song recordings for children, and the film's critical reception was pretty solid overall. Criticism was placed on adaptation issues, as well as Tolkien fans questioning the material being repackaged in such a way for very young audiences. The film would go on to win and be nominated for a few awards, such as Romeo Moeller winning a Peabody Award for his teleplay, and the film being nominated for the Hugo Award for Best Dramatic Presentation. The film would eventually get a sequel in the form of The Return of the King several years later, after United Artists completed their adaptation of the first two Lord of the Rings books. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's go into my thoughts on the film. I will always remember that day my parents bought The Hobbit for me on DVD. We were in Circuit City looking at new movies to buy for our pretty new DVD player at the time. And I had come across this little film and instantly wanted it because, listen, I was very young, maybe 7 or 8 years old at the time. I had already seen the Lord of the Rings films in the theater. I had already seen Ralph Bakshi's animated Lord of the Rings. But surprisingly, at that point, I had never even heard of The Hobbit. Not even the book it was based on. But I saw that it was a prequel to The Lord of the Rings and was about Bilbo's adventures, and so of course I had to see it. Lord of the Rings was everything to me at the time. So yeah, this was my first time experiencing this story, and as I said in my intro, I loved watching this film. It was short, sweet, and simple for me, and boasted some unique imagery and fantastic music that I, of course, got stuck in my head, and it's always been a film I've been very fond of, and I always go back to it every couple of years because, in the end, it's an extremely memorable little film. I do briefly want to bring up how well I think this works as an adaptation, actually, which isn't really something I bring up too much often because I like judging films based on what I'm watching and not necessarily what the film is based on, because I think adaptations shouldn't be bound down by their source material. But in this instance, I do have to mention how I think this film does a great job of adapting its source material in a whimsical children's fairy tale that pays tribute to the book, but also makes it its own too. It does a great job of condensing the biggest parts of the story into its simplest form and still remaining true to the original story. There's several things it does omit here and there, but none of this hurts the overall story. It mainly just streamlines it for the 75-minute film they needed it to be, and I think also does a good job of keeping the book's spirit and themes intact to make for a very satisfying watch. So yeah, as an adaptation and its own thing, I think this film works surprisingly well at laying out this story for a younger audience to easily understand, and deserves more credit and recognition than I feel like it gets. Honestly, I think animation is the perfect medium for an adaptation of The Hobbit, and Rankin Bass and the team at Topcraft give us a beautiful and sometimes frightening depiction of Middle-earth. And I just overall love the animation in this movie. Everything just has this very unique look that becomes instantly recognizable, from the character designs of the hobbits, the dwarves, goblins, Smaug, and even Gollum. They are distinct looks that make the Rankin Bass version of The Hobbit very unique. The dwarves have this very traditional dwarf look with large noses and tough-looking skin, and they definitely put the age on a lot of the dwarves to have them have this very ancient look to them. Then you have Bilbo himself, who is just a very iconic roly-poly look with extremely furry feet and large chipmunk-like face. He's very recognizably human-like, but has the fantastical look that gives him his own unique qualities. It's a very pleasant design for a character and fantasy race who is supposed to be all about relaxation and laziness. I also appreciate the design of the goblins, especially their two throats, which gives them an instantly iconic look. I like, too, that they make a clear distinction between the elves of Rivendell versus the wood elves of Mirkwood. Elrond is very much human-like, but has an angelic quality to him, whereas the wood elves are depicted as scrawny and more creature-like. And I don't know if this is a hot take or not, but I love the dragon Smaug's design. It's unlike any dragon design I've ever seen, with a cat-like design and whiskers. It's not how I would have designed him, but it's instantly striking and gives this version of Smaug a unique personality compared to his live-action counterpart. And finally, you have Gollum, which looks more like a frog than a human now, with wide eyes that make him look blind since he's mostly in the dark. Everything is just very distinct in this film and fantastical and different from depictions I imagine when reading the book, and that's completely fine. The Hobbit has a look all its own and is just a unique interpretation of Middle-earth that's different from Ralph Bakshi's interpretation as well as Peter Jackson's. And the film switches between the classical fantasy valleys and forests to dark caverns and woods, and feels like something akin to the dark woods in the beginning of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. The designs of the swords and armor and gold are also really nice and immaculately designed with jewels and etched with intricate little patterns. As for the characters and the actors that portray them, they couldn't be more perfect, and the amount of talent they have behind the voices is just incredible. Orson Bean is the perfect Bilbo, who really transforms from someone who just wants to stay home in his hobbit hole into a proactive hero that takes charge in many different situations, such as the trouble with the trolls, his encounter with the wood elves, and his confrontations with Gollum and Smaug, which are wonderfully translated from book to screen so vividly. Smaug in particular is also great, with a commanding Richard Boone performance, and it makes his different design that wouldn't seem that menacing very much so. But my favorite out of the whole bunch has to be the legend himself, John Huston, as Gandalf the Grey. This is just perfect casting to me. He's commanding, wise, terrifying, and altogether strange. And combine that with his animated design, and you have the absolute perfect Gandalf, in my opinion. You also can't talk about the movie without talking about the music, which is lifted right from the pages of Tolkien's work and brought vividly to life with so many catchy and fun songs that are instantly memorable as soon as you listen to them. It turns the movie into a fantastical musical that brings out the child in all of us, and it also does a great job of informing the story. The songs don't just stop the flow of the narrative, but provide important backstory or tell you a little bit about the characters and situations. Even the one original song for the film, The Greatest Adventure, performed wonderfully by Glenn Yarbrough, is such an iconic ballad. and is a great song in its own right that it's instantly what I think of when I think of this movie. It's got that adventurous spirit, but provides us with a sentimental look at the adventure. And I love how it's used in certain instances to inform us about Bilbo's character arc as he becomes braver and braver. The movie also does great justice to two of the best scenes from the book, the Riddles in the Dark segment and the encounter with Smaug. Both are filled with a lot of tension and great performances, and are just great to see adapted to the screen. And Gollum's threat at the end of his segment is threatening and filled with malice as he curses and hates Bilbo, who stole his precious, the One Ring. They also do a great job of conveying many of the Hobbit's themes of greed, power, friendship, and misunderstandings, especially in the final moments of the film, when the men of Lake Town, the dwarves of the Lonely Mountain, and the wood elves of Mirkwood begin to clash in an epic battle, but are then stopped by Gandalf, who shows them how they have let greed enter their hearts and should be fighting side by side to take on a much greater threat. In the final moments of Thorin Oakenshield, the main dwarf, is something that will always stick with me, as he has one final conversation with Bilbo about his own faults, and how if more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. It's haunting final words that are uplifting as well as sad, and really makes that ending stick the landing for me, as well as Bilbo's return journey, where Gandalf helps Bilbo understand that he is a hero in the end. It's great moments like these, which is why I love watching this movie. It takes moments from the book and manages to still provide some of the weight in the original story. It's a wonderful little fairy tale that I can't help but always find enjoyment in. That said, the film isn't without some flaws that are small that make the experience memorable but not altogether perfect. The movie, I think, could have benefited from being a nice 90 minutes rather than 75 minutes. It would have allowed more character moments from the book, but that said, it's also a brisk 75 minutes. No scene really drags, but there are parts that are simply glossed over in the story that I think could have benefited from being longer. The animation can also be less than perfect at times, but some of that is simply due to the smaller budget this film has. It's never an actual problem, though. The film does have some interesting choices of how it decides to tell a story, though. Simply put, about halfway through the film, Gandalf leaves the party, and Bilbo is left to pretty much be the leader of the group, and we begin getting this narration from him as if he were writing to Gandalf. And it's just a strange choice, but again, not really a problem either. In the end, though, The Hobbit really isn't anything special. It's not that remarkable. It's just a simple little film that clearly had a lot of heart put into it that makes any faults it might have inconsequential. It's a great retelling of the book that I think will enchant younger viewers and even entertain some older viewers, as well as I think it actually is a better entry point for The Hobbit than the book itself. But shouldn't be a full substitute for the book either. I think people who grew up with this film will enjoy it a lot more than those who haven't, and there's nothing wrong with that, because it isn't anything too special, but it is a film that has stuck with me through the years, and I love revisiting it from time to time, and that's why I wanted to discuss it. It's an important part of my childhood and an overlooked piece of animation that I think is well worth anyone's time that wants to get into Tolkien or just wants to see a fun little fantasy film. So, with all that said, I'm going to give The Hobbit an 8 out of 10. I was originally going to give this one a 7 out of 10, but when I was writing this review, just everything I was saying just kept reinforcing to me that I do love this, and not everyone is going to feel that way, because it is flawed. It is simple. And this is just a film that I think has that mix of nostalgia that makes me look at it with rose-tinted glasses a bit. But it's also still good no matter how you look at it. It's nothing spectacular, but it didn't have to be as good as it already was. So, if you haven't watched the 1977 made-for-TV Hobbit, I definitely would say give it a try, and if you're wanting to see a little glimpse into Middle-earth before the Peter Jackson films, this is a great one to start out with, and I think is a great entryway before reading the Hobbit book if you're not quite ready for it. I'm so glad, though, I got the chance to talk about this. I've been wanting to talk about the Middle-earth films for some time now and was just waiting for that right time to talk about this one, and I'm very happy I did because it was a joy revisiting this film and falling back in love with it. I don't know when I'll be talking about the other animated Lord of the Rings films or even the live-action films, but I will get to those eventually at a later date. But if you have seen The Hobbit, what do you think about it? Let me know, and as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel, and stay positive.